Hi folks, today's video is going to be about this rifle that I've got here on the table. It isn't that remarkable mechanically, and on this channel we normally talk about the mechanics of things, but it is an interesting rifle, and I want to do a little bit of a show and tell with it. So what are we looking at here? Well, this is an svwMB coated Mauser. As you'll see in the video title, it's lowercase svw, uppercase MB. It's made at the Mauser factory, Oberndorf am Neckar, during the very end of the Second World War. Mechanically, it's not that remarkable. It's a full Kriegsmodell K98. It's a large ring Mauser, 8mm Mauser, cock on close action. Very typical of Mauser's refined bolt action repeater. It has the flag type safety on it, where up is safe, all the way to the right is your bolt lock and safe, where you can't lift the bolt. Safe there, still works normally. And then over here is your fire position, where of course the bolt can be moved. Bolt removes out the back with this lever here. Fairly routine stuff. 5-round internal magazine fed by a stripper clip. Not very remarkable mechanically. If you know how a bolt action works, this is very similar to most of them. Most of the popular ones these days, they're based on Mauser's 98 action. What makes this one interesting though? Well, if I turn it over, and if you are very familiar with K98s, you'll notice the sling is a little strange. It's not much of a Mauser sling, is it? Normally they would go through here, lay against the stock, and they would attach here like this one does. So why did I have the wrong sling on the rifle? It is not the wrong sling. It is the right sling, because over on this side of the rifle, instead of having the old eagle that you typically see, it has got a star. And that is a French proof mark, and this is a French sling. So why does it have a French proof mark? Because the Mauser factory at Oberndorf am Neckar, which fell to the Allies, the American Army, in April of 1945, ended up in the French occupation zone. And so the French ended up with the factory, all the leftover parts, all the equipment, everything that was left over at the end of the war, because the Mauser factory manufactured up until the capture. They didn't really try to relocate it in any significant way. It was still all there. There were guns on rail cars being ready to move, but it was captured essentially intact. Machines still running, parts still there. And this is made with those parts. The French, as they sifted through all their spoils of war, the Mauser factory was a way that they kind of got their war reparations. So they made up a bunch of rifles like this. I say a bunch, probably in the ballpark. I believe that these go to the D block of the svwMB, but svwMB is just a continuation of svw45. Mauser's prior code was BYF. Some of the parts on here are still marked BYF. The floor plate, I believe, is marked BYF. So there's definitely a mix of different codes on this rifle. They were just using whatever parts they had. Particularly being French assembled, nothing's matching on this. And if it was matching, you would start asking some questions about why. One of the answers on why an svwMB Mauser might be all matching is it was actually made prior to the Capture the Factory. There are some of them out there. There's a little bit of debate on whether they are genuine German or not. I think that's a silly debate. There's definitely some that were made with the svwMB code prior to the Capture the Factory. Not very many. I would speculate, maybe a few thousand, 5,000. It's hard to tell. Mauser did not, even though it's a serial number, they are not necessarily sequential. What I mean by that is it was a very large operation they were doing there, and they would be working on multiple letter blocks for a year code, for that factory code, at the same time. So especially at the end of the war, they didn't necessarily finish all the blocks. So this one is nearly 3,000, 2,700 of the C block. It is fairly representative of that extremely late style. The only thing that's a little odd that you might notice is it actually has a wood stock as opposed to laminate. Kind of strange. They typically on a Kriegsmodell would use a laminate stock, as they did from about 1941, I think, onward. I could be wrong on that, but wood was phased out fairly early in the war. But then they brought it back because they were having issues with getting laminate supplied to them, the laminate wood. So this is actually a wood stock, which is very strange for late war, with the exception being these extremely, extremely late production, the ones that were in the factory during the Capture of the Factory. But let's talk about the rifle itself a little bit, because as far as what makes this a Kriegsmodell, everything. It's very, very, what they call a full Kriegsmodell. This is definitely fully it. Like I said on the stock, we don't have a laminate stock on here. It is actually so late that they were having issues getting the laminate, and we're using wood again. The butt plate here is a cup butt plate, unlike the extremely early ones, which were flat. They went to cupped. This has holes in it though, here and on the other side, with a hole drilled in the wood. That's because you do not have the disassembly disc in the stock. They omitted that and just drilled a hole here for disassembling the bolt. Of course, you have your spot for the German style sling. This is not typical for a German produced rifle. This bar here on the stock is put on by the French for taking the French sling, so they wouldn't have to use any kind of special accessories. They could just use French accessories on it. The bottom metal is fully stamped. The trigger guard is stamped. The floor plate for the magazine is stamped. Interesting to note, it does not have locking screws for the bottom metal screws. The rear screw here, though, has a slot in it, just plain slot, whereas the front screw, it's a slotted screw, but it actually has the 3 spots on it for taking a locking screw. So they were still using front screws, or well, at least front screws, because they were not interchangeable. But the front screw, at least on this one, is the type that would accommodate a locking screw. Even though there's no spot for one, it's not cut to take one. Kind of interesting. The bolt, fairly typical of a late war bolt. A little bit rougher machining, straw color on the extractor. Nothing really to say there. Rough machining on the receiver itself. Not terrible, but it's definitely not polished. It's a little rough. The sight here has no range indications on the bottom side. Those are only on the top. When you get to the barrel bands up here, they are stamped sheet metal, welded together. On this one, on the rear band, it's on the side. On the front band, it's on the bottom. Rather than having that spring steel retainer, They are held on with this little small wood screws. There is also one on the front where you'll see that there is not a bayonet lug. The bayonet lugs were omitted on these very late production rifles. Some of these you'll see will have a French stacking rod on them. It is a little bit hit or miss on which ones have them and which ones don't, and I'm not sure why. I've seen other rifles that are a later serial block, they were in the D block, that do have it. This one being a C block does not. Maybe they didn't have stacking rods, maybe they started putting them on and quit, or I don't know. I don't think it's taken off. It definitely appears to be a period correct screw, so I don't think anyone's removed the stacking rod. I don't think it ever had one, but some of them do have a stacking rod. Not sure why. I don't think anyone really knows. There's not a ton of information on these, unfortunately. The front sight is interesting in that it does not have a front sight hood, but it is cut for it. So apparently the French were not really that keen on putting the front sight hoods on for whatever reason, but it is the later war style where it can accommodate a sight hood. It does not have one. As far as I can tell looking at it, it was never fitted one. I don't see any marks, any indication that anything was ever installed there, because they clamp on pretty tightly, and I think it would be visible if one had ever been installed. I don't think it ever had one. But not much to say other than that. It's an extremely late war simplified K98 that was so late that it didn't actually make it out of the factory before falling into Allied hands and ultimately being occupied by the French, where they put together rifles like this one to accommodate French tastes in sling attachment. What's the purpose of this? Some of these apparently ended up in French Indochina. I'm not sure how many exactly. Like I said, there's not a ton of information on these. One thing that has been said is that if the Soviets tried to push all the way to the Atlantic, that they could take these and rearm some of their POWs and continue to fight the Soviets. How much validity there is to that, I'm not sure. I haven't really seen any good documentation of it, but it certainly seems reasonable. In the video that I did on the Lottie pistol, that is a Swedish-made, finished design for the Danish government, those were bought by the Danish government in exile with the thought that at the end of the war they may have to deal with the communist revolution, and wanted to be able to arm a certain number of people to try to suppress that. So I think there is probably some validity to that theory. Whether that was ever documented or not, I haven't seen it. But I think that's interesting to think about, where the French are taking a German rifle made in a German factory, possibly assembled by German workers. I don't know for sure if they had the French workers put these together, or if it was German factory workers. But nonetheless, interesting rifle that represents a very, very unique period in time, where it's kind of the end of World War II, where you see the extreme simplification of what had been a very beautiful rifle, still mechanically very nice, but then you see kind of the beginnings of the next stage of the world. You see the Cold War starting to rear its head there a little bit, with a French sling on a German rifle, potentially to try to suppress a Soviet invasion. So I just wanted to do a little show and tell with that. I think it's a very interesting rifle. One thing I'll note, just as we're finishing the video up, is that if you have one of these and you're looking for a sling, it has to be one like this. It will take a German sling. It's not the correct sling. This should have a French sling on it. But most of the French slings you find are this type, that are a little bit wider. These are just Moss slings, MAS slings. They usually have this little flapper here, and you cannot fit this through the front band there. So there's two different styles. I believe this is a newer style, whereas this is an older type. I'm not sure if this sling is real. I think it might be a reproduction, but it looks really good, so maybe it's real. I don't know. It's either a really good condition real one, or it's a really nicely done reproduction. I don't know enough about them to be able to tell you for sure. But it does fit correctly, and after a lot of looking, I found this on eBay. Really happy with being able to complete this and actually have the proper sling for it after quite a few years of looking. So thanks for checking in, folks. I hope you found it interesting. There's not much to say about it. There's not a lot of information on them in really intricate detail. Total numbers that got the svwMB code are probably somewhere to the tune of 20 or 30,000 ish. Like I said, it's hard to know given the period in time this comes from, but kind of a cool little slice of history. So thanks for watching. Check back next time for something else.